City of Edmonton Community Services, Sexual Assault Center Edmonton, CEASE, the Action Center, the Action Coalition for Human Trafficking, Catholic Social Services, Children's Services, this Region 6, Protection of Sexually Exploited Children, our Edmonton Police Vice Unit, and we have a link into City Council. We commit to raising awareness among the community and then to advising City Council on these issues for the decisions that they will have to make on our behalf. So welcome tonight, and I know that we've got a great panel here and a great moderator, and it'll be a good evening. Thank you. Oh, I'm sorry. I was going to tell you why we're wearing orange. It's because it is a color chosen by many in the international anti-human trafficking work. And for us, it brings together the yellow, the warmth of heart and compassion, and red, which, you know, symbolizes anger at the hurt that so many people experience and the degradation. So when you bring them together, you get these lovely shades of orange, which then help us move forward in our action. Thank you.
So just a couple more quick announcements just before we move ahead. This is a sensitive subject and it may trigger some emotions for folks. We want to make sure this is a safe environment, and if you are feeling overwhelmed, we do have Christina from SACE who is available here to go into a safe room and process some of those emotions. As well, we'd just like you to be respectful of people in the room and just to remind yourself of that. The other thing is we are going to have an opportunity for some questions at the end. On your table is a little piece of paper and some pens. What we'd ask you to do is while our panelists are speaking and you think of a question, jot it down quickly, and myself or Crystal or Heather will be around sometime near the end of the night to pick them up, and then the moderator, Chris, will certainly ask as many as he can before we run out of time. So that brings me to our moderator. Chris is my friend. He's a storyteller and a people weaver. And in addition to leading communications for the Alberta Council for Global Cooperation, he's produced a whole bunch of other really cool media shows. We're really happy to have him, and I'm going to pass over the mic to him because he's way better at speaking than I am. Here you go.
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for coming tonight. Thank you to our panelists for having the courage to share your perspectives on a painful issue that affects us all, and to our audience today for joining us in this dialogue, and to the Sexual Exploitation Working Group for hosting this event. To our audience, it literally wouldn't be possible without you being here to engage in this conversation and continue it afterwards. Alec and I were talking about wanting to make this a really good conversation that everybody gets a lot out of, and we were saying, oh, good thing that it's a totally non-controversial topic that nobody has strong feelings about. But we're going to discuss tonight how our society talks about sex and consent, how that connects to a culture where rape is normalized, who it affects, and what we can do to shift it, to make it budge. But to begin with, let's introduce our panelists today. So we have Lise Gattel with us, a professor and chair at the Department of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Alberta. Lise's research has focused on gender and law, and she's worked with the Sexual Assault Voices of Edmonton and on the board of the Women's Legal Education and Action Fund. And if you listen to Q, you know that she doesn't shy away from an intense discussion. Nikki Bernier is the Director of Public Education at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton. She's also involved with committees like Community Initiatives Against Family Violence and, like Lee's, Sexual Assault Voices of Edmonton, which you've probably seen their work if you haven't heard of them, because they were behind the Don't Be That Guy campaign and another project to reduce gender-based violence on campuses. Danielle Boudreau is here from White Sky Vision. She's been involved in raising awareness of violence against women for over 12 years, including through the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women's Conference. Danielle has been a victim of sexual exploitation herself and also speaks from family experiences of murder and addiction. She was recognized as Most Inspiring Woman of 2011 by the Women Entrepreneurs of Canada. George Ishiakwene, I'm coming back to you. I'm just going from what I... George works for the Edmonton Multicultural Health Brokers Co-op, focusing on issues of family violence in the African community. And George asked me to distinguish a little bit if I mentioned his two reputations here. Internationally, he's known as a physicist, which I think is amazing. He was born in Liberia but received his PhD in physics at the International Center for Theoretical Physics in Trieste in Italy. But then he studied education, ended up teaching at Liberian and Ghanaian universities before coming to Canada in 2004. His work in Edmonton has focused on helping African men deal with new systems of education, employment, justice, and health in Canada. Ryan Jesperson is the host of Breakfast Television on City TV Edmonton and a self-identified feminist. Ryan has extensive experience in broadcast media and newspapers and joined City TV in 2005. He's a very public face in our community. He's been on the board of Edmonton's Next Gen, Movember Edmonton, and Arts Scene Edmonton. Thank you for joining us, Ryan. And definitely not last, or last, but definitely not least, Staff Sergeant Shauna Grimes, an officer with Edmonton Police Service. She's worked with EPS for 21 years. Previously as an investigator with the homicide section and the Alberta Serious Incident Response Team, and now with the sexual assault section. So thank you to all of our panelists. So I wanted to set the table to begin with and define what it is we're talking about. So this first question is for Lise, Danielle, and Shauna. How do we define sexual violence, particularly from a legal perspective?
Well, I'll talk about sexual assault more specifically. Sexual assault is any kind of sexual touching without consent. And in Canada, we have a really high standard for consent. Consent must be active and ongoing. There's no such thing as implied consent in Canadian law, and you cannot give your consent in advance in Canadian law. So sexual assault is any kind of sexual touching that is not consented to.
From a legal perspective, can you speak to what the bar is?
Yeah, I think that Lise is correct. It's pretty high, and the biggest issue that we see, or part of what we're going to talk about tonight, is the idea of consent and the fact that it needs to be actively ongoing, and it can be changed and taken away at any point. So that's something that sometimes people have a little trouble understanding, but it forms part and parcel of a criminal act.
Danielle, does that mesh with what you've seen with how the law interprets what sexual violence is? You got a green light on the bottom? Yep. You can borrow mine if you like.
Hello, okay. Legally, I think in my world, sexual violence, there's a level to where people will go for charges and whatnot. And I guess for myself, when I hear about the legalities of what is sexual violence, to everyone, I think it's what may be sexual violence to me may not be sexual violence to you. I think it's all within our own person, and whereas we could be touched on the outside of our clothes, it might be as serious as being sexually assaulted to the heaviest extent. I mean, at the end of the day, it hurts, and what's the penalty going to be depending on what the act is? Do you understand what I mean? I don't think that it's not defined in legalities of if I get touched by hand, by penis, by anything, is it more time, is it less time? So for myself, there has to be more, written things about it. Is it worth even going to the courts for?
If it's still not working, you can pass back and forth, you and I.
Check. Now it's kind of working.
Great.
Okay, now it's working.
To address that, to broaden the circle a little bit, this question is for Nikki and George and Ryan. How do we as a society usually define what is consent and what's sexual violence? And how does this influence what we've come to call rape culture, a culture where we're sort of lulled into thinking that it's normal and it's not a problem? Nikki, do you want to take it first?
Yeah, okay. Oh, I would need this. So the question is, how do we as a culture understand consent and sexual assault? I think that's a really important question because, as all of the panelists have said so far, Canada has incredible, inclusive, really well-established laws when it comes to defining sexual assault and consent. It goes into a huge amount of detail to define what sexual assault is, what consent is when it has and hasn't been given. And in a lot of ways, Canada has been, I think, a trailblazer in defining what this should look like and how the legal system should address the issue. But something that we see is a really striking difference between how the law defines sexual violence and how people in the community understand sexual violence and consent. So as a part of the public education team at SACE, my full-time job is to go out into the community and ask people about, their understandings of sexual assault and consent, and facilitate those dialogues. And in my experience doing this in the past 2.5 years, people's understanding of sexual assault law and consent law, more specifically, is partial at best. To sum it up, the majority of people that I speak to in the community, both adults and youth, think that sexual assault is violent rape, and consent is the absence of no. And so those, the lack of information, and I think especially with youth, the lack of comprehensive consent education that's being provided really lends itself to a culture where there's so much misinformation about how the law addresses these issues.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that I think probably most of us would agree that sexual assault is interpreted differently by different people, and I think sometimes that can be generalized, statistically speaking anyway, into perhaps gender categories, perhaps race categories, perhaps even some people might go so far as to find valid research for income categories or socioeconomic contributing factors to perspectives on sexual assault or sexual violence. I think it's obviously why discussion like this is important, because in some cases what might be completely permissible activity, an activity following which a person might sleep peacefully at night, another person may be traumatized for years. You asked how this would contribute to a rape culture, and I think that that's also an important question, because we do need to note that there are people, perhaps people in this room, who would deny the fact that a rape culture could possibly exist or does exist. They would scoff at the suggestion that there is a rape culture and that there are perpetuating factors. And I think, again, like I said earlier, sometimes statistically you can categorize people into what, generally speaking, as a society would be contributing factors towards certain perspectives or towards lack of progress in certain areas. I think also, though, it's important to note that you can't always categorize people and perspective based on those certain categories. And so, generally speaking, I would concur that I think that we don't necessarily have a congruous, all-encompassing, complete, eye-to-eye understanding, or let's say accepted boundaries of what would define sexual assault or consent.
Yeah. And from my experience working with multicultural groups, I think there is a common understanding as regards to what sexual assault is and its consequences and implications. However, it becomes a little complex when you include the dimensions of culture and where people come from, how sex and relationship are perceived within the culture. And I bet as we go on, we will talk a little bit more about that. But I just wanted to mention, taking it from where Ryan, when he mentioned it being incongruent, definitely it's so complex when you put in the dimensions of culture. Yeah.
Interesting. This question is for Danielle and Ryan, and this speaks a little bit about one of the topics that's been raised already. I think one of the elephants in this room is that this problem does not affect men, women, trans folks the same way. How does gender play into sexual violence?
Well, as a female, check. It's not working again.
The mic doesn't like you.
No, I don't think so. Well, yeah, it's working now.
yeah.
I think it's somebody in the back doesn't like me. No, I'm just kidding.
No, they're trying to make us look good.
As a female, a lot of the times we as women are the ones that are the victims. And with a child who was gay, and in our culture we call that two-spirited. We often think about sexual assault and we're always looking at a woman being sexually assaulted. It's never looking at a man, because a lot of men aren't coming out as much as women do. And with a son who was straight and another child who was gay, I had to raise my children, my boys, into respecting women as a whole and our little girls to respect our men. And a lot of the times we as women need to be accountable to the sexual violence that we have put on others, whether that be rape, whether that be holding it, hurting others that we love. I mean, there's such a wide variety of sexual violence, and it comes in all genders, whether it's male, female, transgendered, gay, lesbian, queer, all of it, you know. And I don't think that it's just one gender. And how I interpret the question is, when I'm thinking about gender violence and sexual assault and sexual violence, I think we're all guilty in a way if we're not standing up for each other and we're not listening to each other and teaching each other what sexual violence is.
Speaking as a white male, obviously, I think that certainly right now there's probably, well, there has been undeniably a certain entitlement or privilege for centuries. And obviously, I mean, folks are educated in this room, and there's a panel that can speak to this more eloquently and with more research background than I can. But there's, you know, ideology is perpetuated when change is not evident. And so I think if you talk about how gender can contribute to a rape culture or to misunderstanding or an understanding or enlightenment with regards to these issues, I think moving forward in the sense of positive action, I think in ensuring that people are well educated in the importance of the idea of how ideas are perpetuated casually or directly. I think also an understanding of sort of structures where men typically, we see it in on the social side, we see it in the corporate side, et cetera, where women are not equally represented in positions of leadership, have not been given equal opportunity in many cases. You know, these are the types of things that I think stifle progress in this area. Again, this is a safe room, I know, and it's an honest room, and my heart is just beating out of my chest right now. You know, it's interesting when I was asked to be on this panel, because this has always been an issue that's been close to me, just because people close to me have been victims of violence. But I've never spoken publicly about it. But you know, when I was 11 years old, I was sexually assaulted, and it certainly has impacted my understanding of these issues and the importance of addressing these issues as a society, in personal circles as well as in a public forum. And I think the more that people understand that sexual assault lurks oftentimes in places where you might least expect it, and that it's not addressed, and that people don't necessarily feel comfortable coming forward, once we can have open discussion like this and a collaborative effort to identify issues and then address those issues, then I think oftentimes there is a gender context of this, but oftentimes also there's not. And so I think coming together, both genders and different understandings of gender can contribute to progress.
Yeah, Danielle.
And just with what Ryan is saying, with this being a private room, when I was actually asked to present on the panel, I sat back for a bit to actually think about it and to think about what I could contribute. And when Chris is asking me questions and I'm thinking about, what he's asking of me and what the questions are, my heart too is racing, because I don't want to say the wrong thing, and I don't want to place blame on people, on genders, on sexes. It's just so hard to be comfortable sitting up in front of all different types of people to talk about sexual assault and sexual violence. And, in a private place like this, and with questions, and you sit back and then you think after the question is being answered and listening to someone else, it's like, I think first and foremost we need to start with ourselves and then bring it out and answer the questions after thinking straight out. So
Thank you both for sharing that. I know obviously this is a pretty close topic to everybody up here, and if anybody at any point, as Alec mentioned, if the conversation gets too intense, search for somebody. Yeah. Lise, did you want to comment to moving up from sort of the personal experiences, how on a societal level gender plays into sexual violence?
I want to just go back to the personal experiences. I think, when we think about raising awareness around this issue, it really started with the women's movement. It started like 40 years ago. And one of the first things that people started to do was speaking about their personal experiences, because only when we acknowledge that sexual violence is something that is pervasive, it happens to all kinds of different people, it's only then that we can begin to understand it and deal with it as a society. So it's really important for us to have these conversations, so thank you. I think, ideas about gender do obviously, especially I would say about gender in the context of heterosexuality, they provide a foundation for rape culture. And I want to just talk about a couple of ideas that we think are really normal. These are, in fact, are things that every day, many of us wouldn't even think these ideas are up for challenge. But norms within heterosexuality specifically, because it is the dominant form of, I'm not heterosexual, so I'm not saying it's the optimal form of sexuality, but it is the dominant, we live in a heteronormative culture. And within heterosexuality still, it's very common this idea that men always want sex, and they're constructed in that way. They always want sex and they push for sex, and this idea of women as being the gatekeepers of sex, right? And those two ideas, those ideas that are still very normal, and probably Nikki sees that when she talks to young people about what is sexual assault, these are very foundational ideas, and they sort of set the foundation for rape culture. Because this idea that you need to push someone to submit is really the foundation for sexual assault. So I think that gender is an important part of this problem. But that said, men are sexually assaulted, trans people experience really high rates of sexual violence, and women can be perpetrators of sexual violence.
Thinking about some of the other things that influence rape culture, George and Nikki, what roles do race, class, culture, and sexual orientation play? George, did you want to take it first?
Okay, yeah. Well, I think I'll be a little biased and maybe speak to the race I come from, because I think that's the one I know more of, and probably limited to the African continent. Yeah, to the African continent where I come from. Generally speaking, sex, which is the medium for intimacy, is honored where we come from. It's given a lot of thoughts. It's respected. In fact, many of our traditional cultures prefer for sex to sex after marriage, so to speak. I mean, if you go into African countries and go into the villages, that would be the kind of teaching, generally speaking. But of course, we know the industrialization and everything has transcended that culture. In any case, there's another side to it, and I remember very well, and I will give a quick example here. I'll try to make it within a minute, where in the cities, when discussions about sex before marriage comes about, in my race, in my culture, many of the women, females, now I'm talking about heterosexual relationships here, where they prefer to ensure that their partner is potent. They don't want a relationship. They don't want to find out afterwards that if they're going to be in a relationship that's not what they expect. I guess you know what I'm talking about. Somebody who probably, the man isn't going to be able to do what he's got to do. You know. So you have this duality, this dichotomy. Yes, I don't want it before marriage, but it looks like I need to get it before marriage to make sure. You know. So in essence, it is something that is respected, that is given a lot of thoughts, there's credence attached to it from our perspective.
Lise was mentioning some of the pressures in North American culture that men experience to think about what are their roles as heterosexual people in relationships. Can you speak to some of the pressures that might influence people?
Yeah, well, I run men's groups, so those things come up a lot. And I'll tell you, men from my group will tell you that they enjoy sexual assault. Why? They don't see it as an assault, generally speaking. A man is, when not willing and no consent, the minute after he gets touched, his whole entire ideology changes. Like she said, men like it. So they don't generally regard it as being an assault if they're impacted. Of course, when pain and hurt come in, then that's when it is considered something unacceptable. So the men, and I'm sure probably Lisa will know from research and other things, that men hardly report. And even if they're aware, they also don't report because they feel, what's the word, as if losing authority, you know. So men generally just accept it in heterosexual relationships. Yeah.
Nikki, can you speak to some of these other things that we swim in as a culture that affect how we think about?
Yeah, so I wanted to just say that I absolutely agree. I think as something that we see come up over and over and over again in rape culture is men's experiences of sexual violence are something that two things that we usually see. They're either just flat out denied, minimized, they don't exist, or they're seen as humorous, right? It's something to laugh at, they're not man enough, or in some instances it's a rite of passage. How can men ever not, if men always want sex, how is it possible for them to be sexually assaulted? And so these are things that people, youth, adults are inundated with all the time. We hear these messages, we see them reinforced in popular culture and ideas about sexuality and consent and sexual assault. And it absolutely creates an environment where male survivors of sexual violence might not feel like they're allowed to identify it as a sexual assault, or perhaps they're afraid to come forward because, they're afraid that no one is going to believe them. Worse or the same, I don't know, maybe people are just going to flat out make fun of them. It creates such a culture of silence around these issues. And I think that's the power of using a phrase like rape culture. I know there's often a lot of objection to this phrase and this concept of rape culture for a number of different reasons. But I actually think, I think it's a really powerful tool to, while still absolutely holding offenders accountable, I think a term like rape culture allows us to reflect and unpack on those day-to-day microaggressions, right? Contributing to a rape culture isn't just actively offending against somebody else, although that is a huge part of it. It's the things that people hear and say and do on a day-to-day basis that make it really difficult to be a survivor in this community. And they're things like, you know, endorsing victim-blaming myths and laughing at jokes about rape. These are things that people don't stop and reflect on the impact and think about the fact that, you know, when we endorse these victim-blaming myths and when we contribute to victim-blaming and this misinformation about sexual violence, we're affirming in a lot of ways the cognitive distortions of offenders, right? Because they're using these myths and this victim-blaming logic to justify what they've done. So I think when I talk to youth, one of the things that I like to do is just think really critically about making a joke about sexual assault or laughing at a joke about sexual assault and thinking of the broader implications beyond, you know, their personal lived experience. Just thinking about how many people are listening to that joke and seeing people laugh and make fun of the issue and minimize it and automatically thinking, okay, there's one more person I can't tell. Like just trying to call attention to the day-to-day things that we do that contribute to an environment where sexual violence is allowed. I think that's a really important piece of youth education that's missing a lot of the time.
One aspect of this word rape culture that I think is interesting is that sometimes we think about culture as like a costume that you put on once a year to demonstrate like your traditional origins, but it kind of, what you're saying, implies something that we actively create on an ongoing basis. Yeah, I mean, by culture, I'm talking about even just commonly held attitudes, beliefs, the ways that we speak. So, I mean, language informs the way that we think about issues. When people don't have language or haven't been taught the fundamental difference between consensual sex and sexual assault, like even something as seemingly harmless as calling a sexual assault in the media sex, or referring to something, referring to forced oral contact as a kiss. Like this is actively a part of the process of minimizing this issue. And I think that's why education is so important, is just to facilitate that dialogue and to think about the broader implications of our day-to-day actions.
But if I just may add quickly to
Sure.
what Nikki is saying, you mentioned youth, and from my experience, many youth, particularly boys, because I work with men and boys, many of them lose their virginity as a result of sexual coercion, either by a female partner who is much older, or a female partner that may be younger or at the same age, but way more experienced. And these boys are lured into this. And of course, just like she said, it just go by the way.
And if I may, you know, when you guys are speaking about that and you're speaking about how younger men, there's a lot of sexual assault amongst peers. And for a child like myself who was sexualized at such a young age, that for me, when I was starting to get into relationships and my partner didn't utilize me as a sexual being, I was almost in a place of, then why are you with me? Because this is what I'm supposed to do. This is how I've been taught. I was taught that I was there, and this wasn't taught by my mother. This wasn't something that was taught in my daily life. It was taught in my mind that we as women were to please our men. And being a part of the ripple effects of residential school and being sexually assaulted from a very, very young age by people who loved me, affection was shown in a sexual way. And so in my teen years, it was so hard to not be sexualized, because then I felt that I wasn't worth it. If you didn't have sex with me or felt that I was attractive and you didn't want me, then it was so hard for me to be a human being because I felt worthless. And with that being said, it is true that a lot of women will coerce just to get that feeling of being worthy, worthwhile, beautiful, and loved.
Ryan, I don't know if you feel comfortable answering this question. Can you share how that sense of expectation may or may not have played into your own experiences?
Just in the context of
This background sort of murmuring of what we expect of ourselves, what we're told of what our roles are.
Yeah, certainly. I grew up in a very conservative religious household. So, my understanding of sex was always kind of the holy grail on your wedding night kind of a thing. There were obviously, issues in the greater context of the church. I don't think we probably don't want to get too off track here in talking about that. My sister is out and proud. My cousin is out and proud. My uncle is out and proud. So my immediate family experience was always one that I believe was enlightened. Although people in my immediate family, some of them really struggled to reconcile with what they had been raised and what was sort of. You talk about culture and fabric and makeup and people's understanding of certain issues around sexuality and orientation and gender roles even. Women in positions of leadership in the church would be another example. All of this, I think, comes together. And so my understanding or my perception of sex was somewhat different than what it is now, just in the context of I didn't necessarily see it as inherently healthy. And I know a lot of people don't, of course, based on personal experience, but I always saw in my mid to late teens, sex as something that was outside the proper context, dirty and shameful. And then, of course, based on some personal experience, also had other issues to reconcile about, comfort, being touched, making myself vulnerable, these types of things as well. So all of that contributed certainly to a journey of enlightenment, can I call it that, based on a number of factors to get to where I am now.
Lise and Shauna, these norms that we're talking about in our society, how do they create bias when it comes to creating and enforcing laws about consent and sexual violence? And we can talk more later about how enforcement plays out, but I'm more curious right now what aspects of our culture play into biases in the legal system as the laws are written.
Well, as the laws are written and as the laws are being interpreted by appellate courts, we see the eradication of bias rather than the reinforcement of bias. And this is something that began in the 1990s when we reformed our sexual assault laws to clarify the definition of consent. And it occurred through really important Supreme Court decisions. The first one was called You and Chuck, which is a decision that affirmed that consent means only yes means yes. So I think, at the sort of highest levels in legislation and, in the appeal courts, we actually see really the development of a very strong understanding of sexual autonomy and a very strict definition of consent. But in terms of how that standard is applied in the day-to-day, there are some issues. I think, the Edmonton Police Service, and I'm sure Shauna will talk about it, has done a pretty good job of dealing with victim blaming. And it's been very proactive on this issue, and it's really, really good to see. But it is the case that there are very high unfounding rates for the crime of sexual assault. What that means is that when you go, and not many people report sexual assaults, it's got the lowest reporting rate of any violent crime. Usually it hovers around 10%. But people go to report a sexual assault, and sometimes police don't pursue an investigation. That's called unfounding. It's a determination that a sexual assault has not occurred. That's what it technically means. But in some jurisdictions, unfounding rates are really, really high. Not here, but some places they're like 38%. So 38% of people who report a sexual assault to the police are the assault is not investigated. It's determined that there has been no assault. The research is showing us, and there hasn't been a lot of research on this question of why are cases unfounded in Canada, but the limited research that there is shows that there's a correlation between the kinds of complaints that are investigated are ones that conform to the myth of the real rape as violent stranger rape. So if you are assaulted by a stranger, then it's likely that your assault will be investigated quite fully. Other kinds of assaults that are not investigated have to do with the identity of the victim. So, and there's research on this in Canada and also in the UK. So people with mental illness, with addictions, their stories are often disbelieved. And unfortunately, people with mental illness and people with addictions experience really, really high rates of sexual violence. So, and, you know, we could talk about how you know, the courts interpret sexual assault and consent on a day-to-day basis, and there's a lot of inconsistency in how the courts interpret it. But at the highest level, we have really, really good law, and we've seen, I think, a real eradication of bias rather than a reinforcing of bias.
Lisa's, oh, there we go. Lisa's absolutely correct. We do have this sort of unbiased standard that's been set in the criminal code, but unfortunately, the people that are enforcing it, all the way through from police to the judicial system, have been raised up in our society and dealt with all these issues that we're talking about. So we have this standard. We struggle to maintain that standard, and I can speak a little bit. I'll talk a little bit about policing, and even within the unit that I'm in, what I've noticed, I've been there for about 1.5 years. I had to go through this, and every new investigator that comes in, we're kind of a little pod within the Edmonton Police Service that almost has to really be educated about this. The whole idea of victim blaming, what does that exactly mean? The idea of using the term rape, what does that mean? The idea that most of our complainants, for lack of a better word, are the more vulnerable people of society. So thus, those investigations are more difficult for us to bring to a successful conclusion. And when I say that, I mean a prosecution in court. That's not necessarily a successful conclusion for the complainant, because the whole court process is extremely onerous on them. And in fact, it can be so difficult that our unit as a whole really operates around what the complainant needs at the point. If they can get the strength enough to come up and make that complaint and have it be investigated at each process all the way through up to court, we allow them the power to stop that at any time. So even when I see one of my investigators investigate a sexual assault, we know this guy's going to go, if it's a guy, is going to go to jail. We've got all the evidence. We may have a complainant that just cannot at that time in her life or his life get up in court, face their accuser or person that has assaulted them, and be subject to the interrogation and cross-examination that they will in public, basically in a court setting. Very, very difficult. So we have these standards that are unbiased, but the problem is that we have to work through it in our society, and it affects judges, police, lawyers, even our complainants themselves. So we struggle with that daily.
I just want to acknowledge that in this room, in case anyone isn't aware, there is an organization that actually is an advocate for people going through that process. Isn't that right?
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. We rely on them heavily.
Yeah, and that's CEASE. Yeah, if anybody is curious to find out more about them. Nikki, I noticed you had something you wanted to add.
I really wanted to just add to what Lisa and Sean are saying. As I said earlier, it is my full-time job and privilege really to get out and speak to the youth who are in our community. And what we find when we go in, I mean, our presentations are on sexual assault and sexual violence, but there's a huge emphasis on consent education. And so we're going in usually at the high school level. The vast majority of what we do is with youth and young adults. So we go in to speak to youth and young adults, and we ask them about consent. And at 14, 15, 16, 17 years old, this is brand new information. And that horrifies me on a daily basis, because I mean, not only do they not know that consent has to be active, voluntary, enthusiastic, ongoing, that people can't consent when they're drunk or high, that if they're pursuing a sexual relationship with someone else, it's their job to make sure that their partner's voluntarily consenting, you know, that people can communicate consent or a lack of consent with body language and words and facial expressions and emotions. They're lacking all of this information, and they're already having relationships with other people, sexual relationships, intimate relationships with other people. And I think that's dangerous. I think as the adult leaders of this community, it is a huge failing to not be giving them the information that they need to go out and have the most healthy exciting, productive relationships with other people. We're not setting them up for success in this respect. And we're not challenging a lot of the misinformation that they're getting from the culture, the media that they're consuming on a day-to-day basis. And they're going out there, they're having relationships without knowing not only how the law protects them, which is very, very important, but what the law requires of them as they go forward and have relationships with other people. And so it's just, I think about that on a day-to-day basis, and it's really resonating right now because we're talking about people who are already in the institutions, people who are throughout the legal system, they're already in different positions throughout the community. And I think that it just, unfortunately, it makes sense when we think of this complete lack of comprehensive consent in sexual assault education, not providing those spaces as the adult leaders of this community, and then wondering, like, where is all this bias and victim blaming and myth endorsing coming from? I mean, these youth are, it's only a matter of time before they are the adult leaders of this community. And I think, I mean, surprise, surprise, the person who does public ed believes in public education, but I think that is such an important, essential site of intervention, is to start this education and start it early as possible. It's so much easier to teach information right the first time than to unlearn a bunch of stuff when you're 40 years old, 50 years old, when you're already, you know, have some life experience and all that kind of stuff.
That actually feeds in well to a question I have for both of you. How does rape culture play out in popular media? I'm talking here about what we see on the news, what we see in Game of Thrones, no spoilers, in advertising, but also in conversations and social media and on our news feeds.
Yeah, well, I mean, just to continue this point here as well, I mean, it's quite interesting. I remember having a conversation with a family member who was struggling with my sister's journey when she finally was able to come out as a proud gay female, and this family member, I could tell in indicating his internal struggle, said, "Do you think that these so-called gay issues are the civil rights issues of present day? In other words, are those that are would be, you know, supporting certain antiquated perspectives, those that would have been burning crosses on front lawns in the 1950s?" And I think that represented an important light bulb that had gone on in this person's brain. So if you cut to present day society, this is certainly not to say that there aren't still issues that the LGBTQ community would face as an example, but it seems like when you speak to younger children, generally speaking, I think it's safe to say, like you said, that they're operating with a more informed perspective from a young age than perhaps those that may have been subjected to some perspectives that weren't as enlightened or that weren't as popular or that weren't as accepted by society. So, you know, you talk about media and obviously the influence that media has on you know, people of all ages, certainly, but especially young and vulnerable members of our society that are just learning to think. And I think that some of the contributing factors are, at the same time, some of the evidence of rape culture is perpetuated in media on an ongoing basis. No one here needs me to explain how, you know, women are used more than men in car commercials in a state of undress, or how, you know, not to pick on video game culture, but oftentimes some of the phraseology used in video gaming and the way that the word rape is casually thrown around in sporting contexts, not obviously on a broadcast, but in a culture that would contribute to that sort of a perspective. Perspectives tend to be perpetuated in a harmful way. Now, obviously, media, the definition of what media is, has also changed with the advent of technology and social media, et cetera, and messages getting out. And so now, if you want to talk about influence of media, on the positive side of the ledger, there's certainly great opportunity for media to play a great role in changing perspectives. It may not be traditional media. You may not find, although we did, I mean, it was our pleasure to welcome Dr. Gattel to Breakfast Television to, in 4 minutes, talk about what we could about rape culture. But the fact of the matter was that at 7:45 on a Wednesday morning or whatever it was on Edmonton Morning Television, somebody was talking about it. Now that's a start, but another start is you know, the media of the people gaining momentum and changing attitudes, and I think that we're seeing some of that now. I think we're seeing people be held accountable. I think we're seeing important questions being asked. I think we're seeing advertisers being held accountable. There's been many examples of sort of well, to speak candidly, bonehead decisions by companies to either in messaging or in product that have seen products recalled and apologies issued due to public pressure, and that is in a sense media. So I think also as our understanding of what media is changes, then also our understanding of the power that media holds changes.
Nikki, can you speak also to the messages that are out there that are being received by consumers of media?
Sure. Well, I think it's worth noting, in my experience anyways, and I am not close to being a teenager anymore, but in my experience, the media that youth are often consuming is pop culture, ads, social media, movies, video games, music, all that kind of stuff. And the way that we see consent play out in these two things is, well, I'm sure there's many other ways, but consent usually, I mean, it's given no attention whatsoever. It's just not even part of the discussion. It doesn't exist because it's always implied. It's kind of the subtext there. It's just not a consideration. Or that a violation of consent is sexy, it's glamorous, it's something to laugh at. I think that again, being and the conflation of sex and violence, saying like violence is sexy and sex is inherently violent. I mean, these are the images and the messages that youth are getting through the media that they most often consume. And so again, when we don't have spaces and opportunities for youth to be given the information and the tools that they need to unpack this kind of stuff, like when we don't take it upon ourselves to create environments where they can have these discussions and work through what they're seeing, I think it creates again a really dangerous situation where, you know, we're not providing them the information about sexuality and desire and sex and consent, but somebody else certainly is. If we're not going to talk about it, somebody else is talking to them about it. It's just a matter of like, do we want to guide those conversations and talk about boundaries and healthy relationships and sexuality and desire, or do we want somebody else to do that? Maybe people who don't necessarily have those young people's interests at heart. And so I think this lack of sexual assault and consent education, it results in all of the things that we see that are part of rape culture. Widely endorsed sexual assault myths, victim blaming, gendered scripts, not having a language to talk about this kind of stuff. Yeah.
Shauna, you have
I just want to add to that because I think you made a really good point when you started to talk about violence. And everybody in here, I think, knows this. Sexual assault isn't about sex. It's about violence. It's a violent act. And when we talk about a violent act, I think most people go to the most extreme thought of what that violent act is. But it's a very personal, invasive act that is, from a police perspective, considered a violent act. And when we start talking, this is getting way too broad really quick, but this starts to play into the whole domestic violence situations and the way young people are raised viewing that, and the massive amount of crossover that we see with sexual assault and domestic violence, and the education around that too. They've kind of almost, from my point of view, really got to go hand in hand. Because Nikki's absolutely right. It's way too late in high school. Mm-hmm. It's way too late. So,
Shauna, who do these... when we have these norms that we're talking about rape culture, how does that affect who police investigations generally protect?
So I'm not sure if I'm
in terms of
in
whether it's meeting the task of protecting victims versus perpetrators, but also within the police service itself, how do biases feed into how the officers may act?
Yeah, that's a good question because we already talked about we were all raised up in this society and we all have certain biases, whatever they are. And I talked about when I came into this unit, I wouldn't have said I had any biases. I'm a female, I'm against sexual assault, but I had to start looking at the way I spoke and get a better understanding of rape culture and victim blaming, and even the way I talked working with mostly men, and what I laughed about. That I never put any thought into that. That's like across the board. That's for, I think, any sort of member of the public. With the police service, one of the ways that we do try to combat that is by having a unit that specializes in this. Same with our other units. Child protection deals with, unfortunately, a very vast amount of sexual abuse against children. And being able to immerse ourselves in that, as that sounds awful to have to do, but it's very necessary for us, even removed from maybe a patrol constable or somebody else that doesn't deal with this every day, day in. It's very necessary for us to be able to do an investigation without, or to minimize those biases, be they against our suspect, some white man did this. We can't be treating people like that, as well as either any of our complainants that come forward. Maybe she works the street. Well, we know that those biases can exist. Well, that has to be quashed very quickly within our unit.
In terms of discounting
because of history, a background, the way they look, any of those sort of things that we're talking about. We've got to be able to be aware of what our own, each person in that unit brings to the table and what they might have problems with. And that's, I mean, it's an ongoing fight. I don't know if fight's the right word, but it's an ongoing awareness that we can't forget within the unit if we want to do quality work.
Danielle, you had a quick response to that?
Yeah, I wanted to actually bring that up around education. Yes, we do need to educate our youth, but we also need to educate each other. Most recently, in December, I was working for a company, and I had explained that I had wanted extra hours, and he had offered me more money if I chose to have sex with him. And being sexually exploited as a youth and as an adult, I actually phoned the police station, and the police officer laughed at me. He said, "You're an adult, and we're all adults here, you know, go meet him, get your money, and get out of there." That wasn't what it was about. And so I hung up, and the next officer that I spoke to, I was very upset, and I mentioned that, and she apologized. And, you know, it's one police officer, but there's so many in there that I actually have to give a kudos to the police themselves, because you guys are trying. You're trying to bridge that gap about sexual violence against women on the streets. I mean, we all know that women who are working on the streets are being paid for sexual acts. But does that mean we need to be paid to be raped, to be beaten? It doesn't. There's no money in this world that's worth that. And unfortunately, the women that are out there, that's happening on a daily basis. And they're always scared to go to the police because they're not taken seriously. And I know some of the questions out there, well, how much were you paid for this act? It doesn't matter how much we were paid. It doesn't matter. He hurt me. I did not consent. And that's the end of it. And in the last 10 years, working with Kate Quinn and working with other women who have been on the street, you know, there is a huge change. It's not very huge. It's starting to get there. And it's people like myself who is experiential and who have family members still out there who are using their bodies to feed their addictions, to feed their families, because they're not educated, because they don't know anything else. And, you know, coming from that background, and one of the things that I had sat at the table and I stated to one of the ladies prior to this was, sometimes the act of prostitution is an act of empowerment for someone who has been sexualized all their life. It's not all the case, but in my case, when I decided to go out and start selling my body, it was something that I chose to do because I was finally making money doing something that was taken from me on a daily basis. Hindsight is 20/20. And now looking back at 39 years old, as a mother of two sons, and you know, we've had there's lots of girls in the family too, and a lot of people in my family have been lost and murdered and missing. And, you know, I sat through trials. I really need to say that we need to educate not only our youth, but our professors, our social workers, our nurses, our police, each other. Because nobody really knows unless you get into the inside of someone like myself, or that poor little lady on the street who is 49 years old, who may have missing teeth, who hasn't bathed in a week. She has a story too, and it's not always sad. And they're not always out there to say, get the fuck away from me. I don't want to talk to you. Sometimes it's as small as, would you like a cigarette? Do you need some water? That small. You could save someone's life just by treating them as a human being, not a human doing.
Chris, I just wanted to jump in here quickly when I heard the conversation about consent and education. Frankly speaking, to bring about change in attitude, behavior of people who perpetrate these things require a lot of, probably a targeted approach to bring about those changing outcomes. Many of the cases that we deal with in our group, there's this implicit understanding that once the man marries a woman, whether civil or traditionally, there's this perpetual consent, that she's his, and whenever he wants to have sex, I mean, that's just it. There's no such thing as no. And whether it's deep-rooted in their upbringing, and it goes both ways, both man and the woman. She wouldn't want to give consent, but has the perception that I can't say no. All right? But then when the education comes in and she's able to say no, and both of them are educated to the extent where, well, they can accept it and, reconcile and mediate and plan, then we begin to have these domestic violence situations. So in fact, a lot of the domestic violence cases that we're handling have these salient features in there. So I agree with you, Daniela. But education, and just education as it is, I think it will require a targeted approach. And I'm pretty sure most of us here are using some well-designed approach. And even public gathering like this does help in such a situation.
Ryan and Lise, I wanted to target a question to you. So we've talked about empathy, we've talked about public education of youth about consent, we've talked about a targeted approach to how we talk about consent and sexual violence. How else can we equip ourselves to tackle these issues as youth, as parents, as community members?
Well, I think raising social awareness is a good thing, and we're doing that here. And that's really good that we're having these conversations. And I think educating young people is an important strategy. I also think it's really time for us to be, saying to our provincial and federal government, this is a serious issue that needs to be taken up in a serious way. You look at the statistics, this is a pervasive social problem that causes so much personal and social harm. We can, Nikki and Shauna and Danielle and Ryan, all of us, we can do this work on an individual basis, and it's really, really important. But it is time for governments to take leadership on this issue. If we think about the province of Alberta, we have very, very high rates of sexual assault in this province. In fact, Edmonton has some of the highest rates of sexual assault in the country. And, many provinces have developed sexual violence frameworks. Provincial governments are saying this is a serious issue and we're going to have a coordinated approach to dealing with it. And oftentimes, too, those policies and frameworks are linked to important questions around equality, because the thing about this issue is that sexual violence is something that is linked with inequality, right? It's linked with inequality. And in order to develop a good policy to dealing with sexual violence, you need to make that link back to inequality. So I'm really, I'm a political scientist by training, and I'm someone who's been involved in feminist activism for a long time, but I think it's time for us to get angry and to push our governments to take action on this issue. It's really, really important.
Ryan?
I absolutely agree, and I think it's also time. I think one of the fears, oftentimes, although the fears in a context like this may be few, one of them is that you're in a sense preaching to the choir. You know, this room is full of people that obviously have a vested interest in this issue, people with varying degrees of life experience, of academic experience, but oftentimes I think you'd find in this group that there may be a common consensus or a common understanding over some of the issues that we're talking about. So the idea is, how do you take something productive and positive like this discussion, like this forum, like all of your attendance, and how do you take that momentum and move it forward? And obviously that would probably be a question trend-wise better left to the academics and those in policing, but I would say that in my own experience, if I can say that, and in the circle of those around me, I think once you develop a certain conviction about the importance of something, and an example would be about the importance of holding governments accountable or government lobbying, about the place from which this anger comes from, this that is positively focused and fueled in the right sense toward a positive outcome or toward an outcome of enlightenment. That's where it starts. And so it starts with little things like having the courage to no longer tolerate certain attitudes around you. I mean, you know, it's funny. It almost becomes a cliche in a discussion like this to say to not laugh at the rape jokes, and everybody just sort of said like, yeah. But like, no, seriously, like it actually takes courage oftentimes to be the one person around the table at the pub or in the locker room or in the golf foursome or whatever to actually say something, to actually question someone's what's gone into their thinking, where that comes from, whether or not they understand what they're actually permitting or perpetuating by making certain comments. And when that conviction comes from a strong place, and when there's a spirit of inclusion in the sense of not necessarily writing people off from a discussion or debate based on their perspective or their background, then I think we move forward.
Another set of tools, of course, we have available to us is traditional and social media. Nikki and Ryan, how do we create a culture of people who use these tools to free ourselves of sexual violence as a society and rape, and free ourselves of rape culture rather than feed into it?
I was kind of hoping that this would come up because something that our public education team has worked really hard to understand in the past year and a half is though some of the unique ways in which the face of sexual violence is changing, particularly in the lives of youth and young adults, as media and social media and smartphones have become a huge thing. And what we're seeing in a lot of instances, what we're seeing a lot of the time is this issue of sexual violence is being facilitated through the use of technology in various ways. And one really important issue, just because of the number of youth that are currently experiencing it to some degree, is non-consensual photo sharing. So sharing photos of somebody sexed without somebody's consent. And this isn't to say that sexting can't be a part of a consensual, healthy, exciting sexual relationship. It's not inherently dangerous, but again, with a lack of information about consent, it's creating a lot of problems. And I feel confident, although this is a generalization, that the majority of youth that I talk to about non-consensual photo sharing have either seen it, experienced it to some degree, know somebody that has. It's a huge problem because we're not seeing it as being part of a healthy part of a consensual sexual relationship. We're seeing it as a tool of abuse. And we're seeing this complete violation of consent and bodies and boundaries and youth experiencing victimization because of technology. Now, I think that it's something that's been really interesting. The more that we've tried to understand this issue is to recognize that, and this was hard to wrap my head around at first, technology in and of itself is not the problem. Violence related to a lack of care or a lack of information about consent has been happening for a very long time. Technology is putting a magnifying glass on existing types of violence, particularly in the lives of young people. And so I think to recognize that, and I don't think that we have any reason to believe that getting rid of technology is going to solve, sexual violence, because it's been around for longer than smartphones and social media and Facebook has been a thing. So I think for a lot of adults and even some youth in the community, the natural jump is to talk about limiting or, getting rid of technology altogether. And I think that it's important to talk about why that's not a great strategy. And it isn't for a couple different reasons. I mean, number one, youth have access to it whether, they're banned from using it at home or not. I mean, the second they walk out the door, even if they've had their cell phone taken away, they're going to go to the library, they're going to access their friend's smartphone. I mean, it's totally available. Another reason that it's not going to work is that it's such an important part of their identity. Their online life and their in-person life, these are inseparable. And it's not only a source of their problems a lot of the time, but it's a really important lifeline that they're using to reach out for help and support should something happen. So I think instead of talking about, banning technology altogether, we need to talk about how we, again, as the adult leaders of this community, can be more involved in teaching youth how to be ethical, respectful, conscious consumers of technology. And I think we haven't been able to do that because, as adults, just by virtue of our age, we didn't grow up with smartphones being such an essential part of our teen experience. So we haven't been able to model what that behavior should look like. And I think nobody was really, I don't think that anybody was able to predict these types of consequences of social media and smartphones for young people. But I think that, teaching them to be ethical, conscious consumers of this technology and being really proactive in teaching them how to use this very powerful piece of technology is something that we should be incorporating into their education. We can't just give a 12-year-old a smartphone and assume that they're going to know how to use it in a way that's safe and respectful for themselves and for other people. So I think it is certainly possible to use technology to solve a lot of the problems that technology is creating.
Ryan, do you mind speaking to more broadcast media? How it can be used to empower rather than...
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting, and it becomes this thing. It's almost like you could print it on a T-shirt. This idea of blame the media, and of course that's been an element of many different discussions for quite some time. Just before I get to broadcasting specifically, just a comment there. I concur. I think those are some astute observations. I believe that any technology or any social media as the medium is not the source of the issue. And another phrase that strikes me equally as powerfully as rape culture would be slut shaming and the perpetuation of that, or even the understanding of that. I think that there's many people that don't even understand exactly what that is. Do
you mind? I'm sure this is a new word for a couple of people, at least in the audience.
Well, I mean, if we can talk in the context of broadcast media as an example here, and it's intellectual bubblegum at best, and it airs on our network, but The Bachelor is a very popular program, and I don't know if anyone in here watched this season, but there was a classic example of slut shaming watched by millions, celebrated by many, but for the first time actually deplored by millions as well, which was significant. For the first time in the history of this really sort of, it's a really questionable platform, this program, if you ask me. But basically, in sort of 2 sentences or less, The Bachelor had sort of found this one early contestant, 25 of them trying to woo him and capture his heart for the honor of being his bride. One of them early on developed a sexual chemistry with him. There was consensual sex in the ocean, and then the next week, in front of in front of millions, in front of America, so to speak, he slut shamed her in the sense that he took what he perceived to be the high road because he was a single father and his daughter would be watching this program. He didn't feel comfortable with continuing this physical relationship that they had and essentially heaped sort of a shame or an onus of responsibility onto the woman who had obviously overstepped her boundaries of what would be perceived to be her role as a contestant on the show. He took no responsibility for the consensual sexual activity that there was. this would be one example. There's many different interpretations, but for once, actually, or for the first time that I can think of, in primetime television, people started to discuss slut shaming. The hashtag started to trend, if you will, literally, actually, not just metaphorically, but I mean, these are the types of situations where not only did the phrase maybe not exist, at least in popular vernacular 5 or 10 years ago. I mean, perhaps it did, but not in a context that many people would understand it to exist. But also people felt comfortable talking about it and recognizing it. I think that's important. Now, with regards to broadcast media being a positive influencer, again, I would, and you know, to reference the famous Edmontonian Marshall McLuhan, I think that the medium is, he would claim that it's the message, but oftentimes it's how it's being used. What is the message? And then is broadcast media the way that message gotten out? So I don't know necessarily that broadcast media can be solely a negative or a positive impacting factor, but broadcast media exists to have conversation and communication. So in that context, I would say I think that it's obvious the role that it can play.
I think we have time for a couple more questions. Yeah, great. Shauna, we have this toolkit that we're building here of the broad strategy for addressing sexual violence. What would you like to see added to the legal toolkit? Or how it's used?
Well, I think I've talked about this a little bit more. And again, we're coming back to something that we're kind of beating a dead horse here, but the education is just such a huge thing. I see the effect of people, no ill intention, but just not understanding what this means and how it gets self-perpetuated over and over through every aspect, through the general society, through the judges and their decisions that come out in our sexual assault trials that run ahead, through the investigators, the police, through the prosecutors. We have very good Crown prosecutors and investigators, but as many good ones, there's ones that have perpetuate this myth unintentionally. And the education around it, getting them young, and it's baby steps. The fact that I don't watch The Bachelor, so I didn't know all this. That's very interesting and actually gives me a bit of hope. That's a baby step. But the fact that there was that much outcry and people naming it and people talking about it, because sexual assault is a really uncomfortable subject and people don't want to talk about it. Normal people, my grandmother, my mother, they don't want to talk about it. 20 years ago, people didn't want to talk about drug addiction and alcoholism. And I know that it's still maybe not super common, but it is certainly a lot more comfortable of a topic. And it took a decade and a generation to make that change. And I think I would love to someone flick a switch and tomorrow it's better, but it's not going to happen that way. It's baby steps, and the more people we can reach, the better. And that's the only way it's going to drive the change to the federal government, too, the more people that start talking about it. So
the conversation has been chipped away far enough that we have a webcast going on. That's pretty exciting. Nikki, George, Danielle, and anyone else who wants to jump in on this question, this is my last question for you. Beyond the personal damage that it does to an individual, obviously there is damage to a whole community when someone commits an act of sexual violence. How do we heal as a society?
For myself, I like to take myself out there and use my story to help others. Because for my story, there's numerous women who have the same story or something similar. About 2 years ago, I probably did the hardest public speaking engagement ever. It was in an old age home. And the people who came to the speaking engagement were in their walkers, and they were really old, and I was scared. I was like, how do I talk about sexual exploitation with these older people, and talk about sex with people that are so old, I just didn't know what to do or how to do it. And I was scared, and I told my mentor, Kathy, who's here with me, I was scared, and I didn't know what to do, and, it's just like, be yourself. And so I did it, and it was very nice. And at the end, an elderly lady came up to me, and she discussed how she had been raped at a very young age and gotten pregnant. They took her baby. She was hidden. She had to go away. She went to a private school, which was her aunt's house in another province or whatever. And what she had said to me was, hearing your story makes me realize that in our lives, there's always going to be someone there to tell the story that I couldn't tell. And going out and sharing that. And even though my background's a little bit different than, you know, the norm, growing up in an Aboriginal community with white skin, colored eyes, you know, being picked on by white kids for being Native, being picked on by Natives for being white. You know, I was always like in between. But where I came from was a group of misfits where none of us fit in, so we fit in with each other. And when I go out to tell my story, you know, a year ago I was asked to come and speak to a school, and I was put in a classroom of kindergartners to speak about sexual exploitation, pimping, and prostitution. Like, how do I do that? But I did it, but not in a way that they knew what those words were, but it was around teaching them about loving each other as human beings and not hurting each other, and how we as a society think that it's okay to pick on someone because they dress differently, or because they look different, or because they were raised differently. And it's those little ones that will get it when they grow up. They'll remember and they'll reflect. You know, you speak about sexting and media, public media and social media and whatnot. And, you know, these young girls, last year I worked on 5 cases of missing and murdered, a young man and a couple of young ladies. And when they were putting the girl's picture out, it was pictures off of Facebook. And I told the family members, don't take pictures of the young girl with the duck face, you know, in the mirror, bathroom pictures, for the simple reason that right away society starts to think that they're easy, that they're acting slutty, and that they're probably out with some boy. The moment that the mother had changed that picture into a picture with her and her siblings and her brothers and sisters and her grandparents, things changed. They actually took it seriously.
Reframing.
And the young man who went missing, he had his gangbanger hat backwards. I said, take that picture off and put a picture of him up with his children and with his family. And right away, things turned around and it actually became, you know, something serious. And unfortunately, he passed away. He was found dead on the side of the road. However, this other young lady, she was found. Out of the 5 cases that I had worked on privately, 4 were alive. The last one being an Aboriginal story. And the only reason why I want to share this is just to kind of give you an idea of how people perceive things. This young man went walking home from a party, and when it was brought to the RCMP and to the community, it was, oh, he probably went to the city to go shack up with some girl. And me and a friend of mine who works for Rescue Alberta, he's a Native man, we talked about this, and I said, maybe we should just kind of take it seriously, talk to the family, and see what they say. And sure enough, the family's like, that wouldn't be him, he would have come home. This wasn't in the media at all. When this happened last year. The young man's name was Halen Cardinal. So we got together a group of horses and whatnot, and we went on a search. And you know, the media, and when they had it out there, people were saying, oh, he probably ran away to go be with a girl, or he's partying, or he's in a gang and he's doing whatever. Well, here this young man went walking home from a party and he slipped and he passed out. 2 days later, he was found alive, frozen, not being able to move. And the first thing he said was, I thought you guys gave up and weren't going to come and find me. And he's alive today. So it's just those little tiny baby steps of changing what we think, like looking past that, looking past the pictures, looking past what you might think the story is. And, you know, it can save a life. And taking things seriously with our youth. A lot of the times, you know, we talk to our children and the children will say something and it's like, oh, it's not like that. Oh, don't worry about it. They were just teasing. something so small could impact them for the rest of your lives. And that's why you need to listen. And I think that it's really important with our education, with our youth, and educating our grandmas and grandpas as well, that we keep it real. And, you know, when I tell my story, I come from my heart. I don't come from school. I've never been to university. I have a grade 9 education. I went to school and did little courses here and there. But at the end of the day, when I lay down at night and I pray, I think about giving thanks for the life that I had, even though it wasn't an easy one, and even though that my life, you know, at its best, somebody would probably can't understand how I'm still here. If it wasn't for people like myself and people like yourselves with your own stories, you know, there wouldn't be a way to share things and to save other people's lives. And that's why I'm really grateful that I'm sitting here with you guys, because my little piece of the puzzle may be small, but it may be something that one of you guys need. I don't know.
Thank you. I want to make sure we have time for questions. So, George, Nikki, final thoughts?
It's hard to speak after that, to tell you the truth, you know. But I think to add to it just a little, I guess the way I see it, a concerted effort. First of all, the topic has no, it transcends all culture. There's no limitation. Everybody is effective. So I see a total involvement of everybody, building up the kind of momentum needed for transformative change. And how the process will go, all sectors ought to be utilized. Even a double-edged sword, which is the media, needs to be utilized. But I think a bottom-up approach probably is better, where maybe local communities, smaller organizations like the ones that brought us here together, can tap on those, on their existing capabilities and resources, and begin to build the kind of momentum that is needed in a collaborative manner. And then we move as an institution, that group as an institution, to maybe harness our people of like-minded people who are already in the government, because we will need people who speak the language to join us and create the kind of change we need. You know, so that's how I see it.
And Nikki?
I'll say something super quick. I think that that it's incredibly important when talking to people to stress the importance and the severity and the pervasiveness of sexual violence. But I think it's really important to let people know when you're out talking in the community, when you're thinking about this issue, to also know that, you know, research consistently shows that when people are supported and believed, and when they're able to get when they're able to access the help and support that they need to heal, the long-term impacts of sexual violence can be drastically reduced. So I think that knowing that healing is possible and that there is something that everybody can do, whether you're in law enforcement or education, or whether it's your child or your best friend or your partner coming to you and disclosing sexual violence, there are really small, simple support skills that every single person in this community can do. And I think that's a really empowering idea, to know that in our day-to-day lives we can do really small, simple things to positively impact the healing journey of survivors. I think that provides a hopeful way of addressing a very serious issue.
Great. Thank you. Thanks to all our panelists.
So I do want to apologize to everyone now. These are really, really good questions, and we're not going to get a chance to get through all of them, but we'll try and get through as many as we can. So, oh, of course you can. Thanks, George.
Oh, good. This will be easy to get through. I think I see a question that was written before the event started here. Yeah, that'd be great. These are thirsty lights up here. All right. While George is distributing water, thank you, George. The first question here, the root cause of these types of issues, like sexual exploitation of women or rape culture, is domination of a particular group back in history, and still continuing in many societies. I think this is a patriarchal domination this is referring to here, that see women as less than men. So how do we address the patriarchal roots of rape culture effectively? Does someone want to take that? Lise, you're itching to take this question.
Why me? Nikki could answer that better than I could.
learned from Lise, so
No,
Lise
no,
is
no,
gonna
no,
take
no,
this
no,
one.
no. Yes. I mean, I think that there's a way in which when we say everyone is affected by sexual assault, and we need to say that, and we need to acknowledge that this transcends boundaries of gender, right? So it's not just women who experience sexual violence. But at the same time that we do that, I think we need to also understand that sexual violence has to do with inequality, right? And there's still sexism and patriarchy, and part of the way in which it's reproduced and reinforced is through sexual violence. But it's also the case that the studies consistently show that rape myth supportive attitudes correlate with racism, with homophobia, with sexism. This is a problem that has to do with inequality. And so if we're just all talking about, oh, well, you know, there's victims and there's sexual assault everywhere and, you know, people have to be individually responsible, we miss those systemic patterns that we need to pay attention to. And I don't have a big answer to that question because it's a big question, but I think we need to keep in mind that you cannot talk effectively about sexual violence without talking also about inequality in its multiple forms.
There's a question here about the legal system. Shauna, you don't have to take this, but you're welcome to. Can you speak to how the legal system can go about giving out the right quote-unquote punishment for perpetrators, and if that kind of compassion or understanding can be, what kind of compassion or understanding can be given to perpetrators who quote-unquote didn't know what they were doing as a result of a lack of education or other institutional factors contributing to that behavior?
So there's sort of two questions there.
Yeah.
Thank you. I'll talk a little bit about how the legal system can go about giving out the right punishment for perpetrators. I think that's sort of that's a hard road to go down. I don't know that, and from what I've seen watching people go through this entire process up to and including a conviction of the perpetrator, as we're talking about, that necessarily aids the healing that Nikki was talking about. And I do think that there's a perception out there that punishing someone, having them spend time in jail, whatever that may look like, will ease the pain of what happened. And I frankly think that isn't actually, it doesn't go hand in hand like that. Traditionally, when we look at our legal system and doling out punishments, and particularly if we look across the border into the States, because they're more prone that way than Canada is, and the 3 strikes rule and all that sort of thing, it doesn't actually achieve what they've set out to do, which is to lower that crime rate or that particular type of crime. It doesn't seem to do that. So the punishment as a tool to lower this type of crime, I don't think we can achieve it by increasing punishments or anything like that. There needs to absolutely be consequences. Do we have the right consequences in place? I think greater minds than mine maybe need to talk about that. There's frustrations with our legal system, absolutely. I know from firsthand seeing that. And sometimes our legal system actually will re-victimize our complainants going forward, which part and parcel leads to the reluctance to possibly report this. I think the reporting of this type of crime aids in the healing. The punishment maybe not so much, but the being able to get the strength to come up forward and say to someone, doesn't necessarily have to be a police officer, this is what was done to me, it was wrong, this is what it's caused, and we see the huge ripple effect of what it's caused. More support around that and around whatever that looks like, I think is actually going to aid towards this. Less focus on our justice system, because our justice system doesn't actually really reduce crime. I'm going out on a limb by saying that maybe, but it doesn't. It doesn't really reduce crime.
And I think George had something to add to
Yeah,
this.
go ahead.
It's intended to reduce crime. But I was
think
just
so.
going to say, society, yes, it's good to get the person come up front and report, but society has a part to play.
Yeah.
Avoid stigmatizing, because that's the dual effect right there. I report, everybody see me as having been a victim, and then I become stigmatized. And then the other thing I want to mention, there's another part to the question there about innocence. I mean, there's a common adage, innocence of the law is no excuse. The responsibility is on you. The onus is on you to know. We'll learn it. There are many ways to learn and know. Yeah.
Danielle, did you also have a quick addition?
Well,
to that?
I was just thinking, I'm sitting here thinking, and they're saying I was innocent because I didn't realize that was wrong. And as a perpetrator, especially in a family, and like George had stated, he'll only talk about his culture because that's what he knows. And in my culture, what I know. And a lot of our perpetrators in my family were ones that we loved. And when you take a look at the residential school and you take a look at these young children, 3, 4, 5 years old, being taken out of their homes, not really knowing what love and affection is, and the educators, the perpetrators, showing them love and affection, grooming them, and love and affection was shown in a sexual way. When those kids grow up, how are they showing their love and affection in a sexual way? So is that normal? Well, maybe to them it is. Is it normal to you? No. From an outsider looking in, it's not normal. But every morning, if you were served pancakes every day, and you come to my house and we eat toast, you're out of your norm. So sometimes those I didn't realize it was wrong can be true. We don't know. And there are some people that I can honestly say that was their norm. There was no other way shown. And it's those that can admit the wrong and say, I didn't know, and actually show a level of remorse, sadness, and share their stories, that we need to pray for those people and show a little bit of kindness too, because not all people and not all perpetrators are bad.
I think this comment that somebody has submitted here actually speaks to that as well. This is more of a comment than a question, but I think in regards to the importance of the use of language in terms of education, when we are talking about victim and offender of violence, it is also important to remember that as a person who works directly with inmates, the victim and offender are often found in the same person. This is not to minimize blame to the offender, but rather to keep in mind that there is a victim often within the offender.
That's true.
Lise, this question is specifically for you. What specific changes of provincial or federal government would you like to see in terms of what types of program or policies are needed?
From patriarchy to redesigning. Well, I mean, I think that there's some, I'll focus on Alberta. I mean, I think that in terms of criminal code reform, I'm not really sure that there's a lot. I mean, obviously there's some tinkering that could be done, but I think we've got good laws in terms of the criminal code. That's the federal government's responsibility. The federal government could be transferring more funds to the provinces, but we live in a rich province that can certainly afford to fund good policies around sexual violence. And I would say that the first and most important thing is to properly fund the sexual assault centers, right? You know, don't subject them to these stupid grants-based, let's come up with a new project kinds of funding. Let's fund them properly. How long does it take to get counseling at the Sexual Assault Center of Edmonton? How long?
My executive director I feel like I'm put on the hot seat. A long time. We have, as the only sexual assault center in Edmonton, one of our biggest barriers that we try to manage on a daily basis is the wait list. It fluctuates based on a whole bunch of factors. Could be 3 weeks, could be 12 weeks. It's a huge barrier for a lot of people.
Okay, and that's obscene in this province, right? That's obscene in this province. So fund the sexual assault centers properly. And also, I'll just, say in terms of, one really important thing is that when someone does make a police report, and not many people do, the kind of response that they get, as we've been talking about, can really have profound consequences. So I really do think we have a provincial framework for training police officers to do domestic violence investigations. We need the same thing for sexual violence. So those are two things that could really change things here in this province if our provincial government endorsed. And really, okay, the other thing I just want to say is that there was a Department of Justice, Federal Department of Justice study that was released to the media about a month ago that put the costs of sexual assault specifically at $5 billion per year. And that study also said that most of those costs are borne by the victims. That's wrong. This is a social problem. Let's all take responsibility for it.
Can I just say something really quick? I said we were the only sexual assault center in Edmonton, but I need to give a shout out to the sexual assault center on campus as well.
And just very quickly, I'm not sure if anyone's here from the Alberta Council of Women's Shelters, but last information that I had, which was within the last 4 weeks, is sort of a scathing indication of where our priorities are with regards to wealth allocation in our province. There are and not to place blame on those who have benefited from provincial investment in flood recovery, but there are mansions that have been rebuilt using the public purse along the river in Canmore, but there's a women's shelter in Lethbridge, I believe, that hasn't yet reopened due to the fact that they don't have enough capital budget resources to repair the damage there. So you talk about priorities and the fact that across the province, hundreds and hundreds of women and children are denied access to emergency first stage shelters because of not enough beds, not enough resources. That to me is something that when we talk about conviction and public pressure, that's an important perspective.
Just to add one more to the tally, in Edmonton, we have also lost access to some of the just first-line emergency crisis counseling services in the last couple of years, too.
But when the provincial government, as an example, cuts, I don't remember what it was, maybe Lisa, you remember, but $137 million, I believe, in the last budget from post-secondary education across the province, and there was public pressure, and there was a dip in the polls, and there was outcry. It was amazing how when the price of oil changed and there was all of a sudden a surplus or less of a deficit than we expected, all of a sudden there was availability of $50 million to go back into public post-secondary education. I don't think that's a coincidence either.
A question here. Are there strategies to bring media makers and influential decision makers, i.e. those with power and privilege, into this conversation about challenging aspects of rape culture, particularly regarding microaggressions? George? Yeah. Would anybody like to unpack what? Okay, so the question was: are there strategies to bring media makers and influential decision makers into this conversation about challenging aspects of rape culture, particularly microaggressions? So microaggressions, Nikki, you'd mentioned. Do you mind giving just a microaggressions? Yeah.
So again, I'm going to say what my understanding of this is, and somebody else might be able to add to the definition, but the things that happen on a day-to-day basis that maybe aren't done with any active ill intent, but that ultimately contribute to an environment where something like sexual violence is negatively impacted. The experiences of survivors are negatively impacted in day-to-day actions that people maybe like that one act alone doesn't negatively impact the experience of a survivor of sexual violence, but all of them taken together, experienced on a day-to-day basis, have a cumulative negative impact on that survivor.
All right. Is that definition okay? Does anybody want more clarification on that?
I guess for myself, when I'm reading this question, just as someone who's small like myself, I always believe that everybody's a human being. And it takes me back to about 4 years ago. I had approached Michael Fulmis, I think that's how you say it. He's with Global News.
I've never heard of Global.
Oh sorry. Well, anyways, he's the CEO of Global News. I can't remember. I think his name was Mike. His name was Mike. That's what his name. But anyways, I went and I said, can you just give me 20 minutes of your time, please? And he said, sure, come on up, 2.5 hours later, he said to me, after I talked to him about so many things, is that not once has he ever been approached by people like myself. And I think a lot of it has to do with the fact that we have this fear that our voice isn't loud enough. And I was speaking with Shauna at the table, and I had told her, prior to 2002, I would not have a conversation with a white person. I had no white friends. I refused to be engaged with any kind of white anything because I always felt less than. And as I got a little bit older and I started to, realize there's a bigger world out there than just my little world, and I started to get to know people, and I started to just be myself and be who I am, speak the way I speak, talk about the things that I need to talk about, I realized that everybody is a human being. And I've approached big people, like Dog the Bounty Hunter. I seen him one day in the casino. I just said, hey, started talking to him, and I talked to him about the march, and he's like, when you come to Honolulu, you come to my office, I'm going to help you. And it's those little tiny things about swallowing my fears, swallowing my pride, and saying, my name is Danielle Boudreau, I'm a human being, and what I have, you might need. That's all it's about.
One more question.
Just very quickly, because we referenced media makers and content creators and those sort of things. And I think it's just very important very quickly to note that the perspective of content creation and messaging has greatly changed from a broadcast perspective. Or not just broadcasting, as a matter of fact, from a media perspective, if I can say that. And that is that instead of being more of and I hesitate to use the word proactive, but if I could say a one-sided approach to broadcasting, in other words, here's the message or here's the content that we have deemed to be important, and now we will deliver this to you. It's now more of a reactive or a two-way conversation with regards to content creation. So speaking specifically even with topics we'll cover on breakfast television, guests we'll bring on, events we'll throw our support behind. Oftentimes it's because of feedback from the community. Don't ever hesitate to hold a broadcaster, whether it's a network, a show, a reporter, a host, accountable to say, why aren't you talking about this? Why has this not been addressed? Here's a story you may be interested in. Here's an issue that I think is important.
And also to bring up who would be relevant to speak to. I think I think a lot of people don't realize that you can suggest, hey, this issue, I noticed that every time you talk about like childcare in the province, you keep interviewing the same person. How about talking to this person?
Absolutely, 100%.
Yeah. There's this lovely, amazing stack of questions. I'm going to usurp and ask one question that I'm really interested in for the last question, Nikki, which kind of I think speaks to this issue in Edmonton. The "Don't Be That Guy" posters. Of course, the visual language of that has been taken and used for this completely other campaign to suggest that rape is mostly a problem of women regretting what they did the next morning, which is obviously false. That's not that overwhelmingly false. That's a very, very small amount of what happens. But does that part of the conversation in Edmonton about rape culture, does that tempt you to want to rip all the posters down and set them all on fire, or to get more deeply engaged in the conversation? Would you like to speak to this too?
Well, we were all involved in the campaign, but my view of those posters is that they've stolen our intellectual property and they violated our use agreement. So feel free to rip them down. But I really don't want to end on a negative note. I think that at this moment, I think that we are facing a backlash, but I look at this panel and the conversation we've created tonight, and there's so much momentum and so much awareness raising, and I think that that's what we really need to focus on, because this little backlash that we're experiencing, I think, is an indication that we are making some real change. Backlash only happens when you make real change, and I think we are. So thank you for organizing the panel.
I think we're out of time, unfortunately. Oh, okay, one final thought.
No, I just wanted to know, is there actually a person that's actually shown their face from that particular group? Like, is there like a Bob Jones there or somebody? Like, does somebody actually, is there somebody, because not once have I seen whoever's making these posters come out onto the media to say, I'm behind this and this is me. So I think that with his posters, maybe he should have some balls to come and say, I made the poster. And then if he doesn't, then you know what? It's just another whatever.
I've taken a lot of courage from you.
I'm not sure that there is someone who has come forward. Is there publicly?
Not necessarily on the record. Elise and I have had a conversation about this candidly before we came on breakfast television about the credence that you give to a movement like this, and I think that is, generally speaking, so preposterous that it's something that's maybe not worth the attention. Obviously, what is worth acknowledging is that these perspectives do exist, but I think, again, to end on a positive, I mean to reference a recent debate that, in my opinion, was a farce, and you might agree that you took part in, Dr. Gattel, on a national radio program. The fact that so many people overwhelmingly identified the problems with what had happened over that hour on the radio were, to me, so exciting and so encouraging. And I think that that's where the focus needs to be. You talk about momentum, and I think everyone in this room can keep that going.
But I'd like to, I guess, volunteer that when Bob Jones does show his face, I'd be more than willing to sit on breakfast TV with him.
I want them all to myself.
All right. Thank you to all of our panelists for helping us build this amazing toolkit. I'll hand the microphone back to Alec here.
So we want to thank everyone for coming tonight. Let's give another round of applause for these, because that was an incredible conversation. So what we do hope you leave tonight with is a sense of what it's going to take to continue to ride this momentum, to keep it going, to continue this conversation going. You can do it in your home, at your kitchen table. That's one of the points that we wanted to have happen, was to bring this issue to the kitchen tables of people in Edmonton. Social media is another great forum. Keep talking about it. Keep moving it forward. Thanks, everyone, so much for coming.